Easter Island's Moai, the multi-tonons, statues, some measuring more than 20 meters in length and weighing more than 75 tons, were carved out of the island's quarry of volcanic tuff and then transported over the island's rugged terrain. Easter Island, and you look at the sites there, the statues, the megalithic walls, you realize they're much older than what, history tells us. Ground-penetrating radar was pushed across the soil of Easter Island, and it came back showing structures hidden beneath the surface that should not be there. Not statues, not what anyone expected. Buried features mapped layer by layer and ground that has been studied for over a century. And somehow, nobody saw them until the radar looked down. The famous stone figures were never the whole story. They were the part sticking out. For centuries, Western researchers have studied the Moai, trying to answer these questions. What the scans pulled out of the dark. Underneath them is the part that quietly rewrites everything we were told about. Who built this island and why? Island that should not exist. Let me set the stage fast because the ground is where this story actually lives. Rapa Nui, the name its own people use, sits in a part of the Pacific so empty it barely makes sense. The nearest inhabited island, Pitcairn, is more than 2,000 kilometers away. The South American mainland is roughly 3,700 kilometers off. It is one of the most isolated inhabited places on the entire planet. A triangle of volcanic rock about 164 kilometers. It is easy to imagine that this is the scene of some catastrophe where things fell apart. And on this speck, alone in open ocean, people built almost atop 1,000 giant stone figures. That is the part that breaks people's brains. The carefully maintained inventory, compiled over decades by the Easter Island Statue Project, has accounted for more than 1,000 monolithic sculptural objects across the island, in museums and inside the Great Quarry Zone. The average Moai stands around 4 meters tall and weighs about 12.5 tons. They were carved sometime between roughly the years 1250 and 1500. Almost all of them from a single quarry called Rano Raraku, cut from soft compressed volcanic ash called tuff, using nothing but stone, tools in a society that had no metal at all. Hundreds were then transported kilometers across brutal terrain and raised on more than 200 massive stone platforms called AU, where they stood, facing inland watching the living. Some even wore enormous redstone top knots called puka, quarried from a completely different site. A crater called Puna, Pow, read that back. More than one specialized quarry, different stone types from different places combined into one architectural vision. The whole island is functionally an archaeological site, and today it is a UNESCO World Heritage location for exactly that reason. For generations, the popular story said, the people who did all this destroyed themselves, cut down every tree, exhausted the land, collapsed into chaos before Europeans even arrived. Cautionary tale about human stupidity. These enigmatic stone giants stand like sentinels all around the island. But what was their purpose? And why have so many fallen? But that story was built on what people could see from the surface, and nobody had really looked underneath it until somebody pointed radar at the ground. What radar sees in the dark here is the tool at the center of everything. And you need to actually understand it, because this is what separates real discovery from internet nonsense. Ground-penetrating radar is exactly what it sounds like. It is a way of seeing into the earth without digging a single hole. An operator moves an instrument slowly across the surface, and as it travels, it fires a tiny pulse of electromagnetic energy straight down into the soil. When that pulse hits something, a buried wall, a slab, a cavity, a layer of different earth, part of the energy bounces back up. An antenna catches the echo. A computer logs how strong it was and how long it took to return. The time is the depth. Do this line after line across an area, and you build a picture of what is underneath your feet, layer by layer, never breaking the ground. Results can be plotted as vertical profiles, as flat maps that isolate one specific depth, or stitched into full three-dimensional models of the Subsurface. Run multiple passes over the same patch, and the picture sharpens, like adjusting focus until a blur becomes a shape. And here is what makes it stand out from every other geophysical tool. Among the methods archaeologists use, ground-penetrating radar is unique in its ability to detect relatively small objects at relatively great depth. And it is the one method that gives genuine depth information rather than just a flat anomaly. That is exactly why teams reach for it when they suspect something is buried but have no idea how far down. This is not fringe science. This is standard, ground-penetrating. Radar is one of the core methods of archaeological geophysics worldwide. It detects and maps buried artifacts, features, structures, and patterning. And it has been used to find burial sites and lost construction across Europe, the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. Here is one to sit with. In the early 1990s, radar survey located the buried route of a 600-year-old road beneath a pasture in Denmark and even traced its internal structure. People thought that road was gone. It was just under the grass. And the magic of it, the reason it matters here specifically, is that it is non-invasive on a sacred, fragile, legally protected landscape. That is not a small thing. Large sites, full of concealed remains, can be read efficiently and accurately while the site itself stays completely untouched. Radar can even point archaeologists towards sensitive areas like burials so they can be protected or avoided on an island where the ground itself is heritage. That is the entire ballgame. But incredible researchers say this part out loud. Radar does not hand you a photograph. It does not draw the buried object. It tells you something with different properties is down there at a certain depth with a certain shape, and then a trained specialist has to interpret what that anomaly most likely is. It works best in dry sandy soil and struggles in wet clay or salty coastal ground. So, it almost never works alone. It is one instrument in a kit. Alongside it, electrical resistivity, which reads how current moves through the ground. Seismic methods, drone-based aerial, mapping, high-resolution satellite, imagery. Stack those together and you can read a landscape like a layered document. On Rapa Nui, somebody opened that document, and what they pulled out of the ground is the part the textbooks never told you. Quick favor before we go. Under the surface, if buried history is your thing, subscribe because the next sections are exactly where this stops. Being the island you thought you knew. The surveys no one talks about. This is the part almost nobody has heard, and I want to be precise about it because precision is what makes it real. Geophysical surveys really were carried out on Easter Island's archaeological landscape by credentialed teams working under permits from Chilean authorities. One of the major efforts was the Rapa Nui Landscapes of Construction project, a multi-year research program associated with University College, London, and funded by the United Kingdom's Arts and Humanities Research Council with data collated across roughly the years 2008 to 2015. This was not a treasure hunt. Read the project's own documented methods, and it is a checklist of exactly the technology we just described. Landscape survey of the platforms, statue roads and quarries with detailed topographic mapping, mapping of the audio-visual qualities of locations, geophysical prospecting specifically aimed at locating buried quarry workings and obscured statue transport roads and their associated features, three-dimensional recording of quarry surfaces and targeted excavation of quarry floors and spoil. That is a complete systematic reading of a constructed landscape, not a glance at a few famous statues. A published account of geophysical survey work on Rapa Nui presented under the title Concerning Moai Quarries and Roads lays out exactly which techniques went into the ground. Ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, seismic methods, all of them applied at real archaeological locations. The conditions were rough, often bone-dry, and here is what tells you these people were honest. Of all the methods, they reported that electrical imaging was perhaps the most successful, that earth resistance worked better than expected, especially after rain, and that ground-penetrating radar was actually the most challenging technique in those particular conditions. They did not oversell it. Treasure hunters oversell. Scientists report what fought them. There was a second front, too, at Anakina, the sandy beach on the north coast that is one of the island's most important early settlement zones. Multiple near-surface remote sensing techniques were applied specifically to characterize the subsurface structure of archaeological features, including magnetometry survey over the beach itself. Strong reflections along a tree line were flagged as possible signatures of human-altered soils. Exactly the kind of faint buried fingerprint these tools exist to catch. So forget the myth for a second. Real teams brought real radar, resistivity, seismic, and magnetic instruments to this island, scanned its archaeological ground, and recorded what was underneath, which leaves the only question that matters. What came back? What was hidden underneath? What did they actually find down there? The honest answer is more grounded than the wild versions online and in a way that makes it land harder, not softer. The surveys detected buried archaeological features. They mapped subsurface anomalies, the signatures of obscured quarry workings, and the traces of statue transport routes that no longer exist on the surface. They picked up patterning in the ground consistent with the island's ancient construction activity. The landscapes of construction projects' stated purpose was to use geophysical prospecting to locate buried quarry workings and obscured statue roads. And that work fed straight into a completely different picture of how this society ran. Now I have to be careful here because this is exactly where the internet goes feral. The scans did not reveal a confirmed underground city. They did not reveal impossible tunnels or anything that needs an explanation beyond human hands. What the geophysical work revealed were subsurface formations and buried features that researchers interpret as connected to ancient ceremonial and construction activity. That is the truthful way to say it. It is also, if you let it sink in, the more unsettling way to say it because of one specific result. The data recorded over the buried Moai at Rano Raraku was described as particularly interesting, and the researchers reached a conclusion that I want you to actually hear. They concluded that geophysical survey may offer a way to locate the many unidentified buried Moai believed to exist across the site without ever excavating them. Stop on that. Specialists with subsurface imaging looked at this ground and concluded there are very likely many statues still buried there undetected right now. That is not a documentary voiceover. That is the assessment in the survey literature itself. So the real question is no longer whether something is still under Rapa Nui. It is how much and why these people buried so much of what they built. The Moai were never just statues. Step back from the radar because the bigger shift is in your head, not in the soil. For generations, the Moai were imagined as the obsessive output of a society that lost its mind. Vanity monuments that help doom the people who carved them. Modern research takes that idea and turns it inside out. And it starts with a simple question. Why are the platforms where they are? A team of researchers used quantitative spatial modeling to test that statistically. They did not eyeball a map. They modeled every site against the three resources that actually decided survival on this island: agricultural gardens, marine resources, and fresh water, and tested which link was real. The result was almost eerie in how consistent it was. The monuments line up with the island's scarce fresh water. On a dry island with almost no streams, where fresh groundwater seeps out diffusely, often right at the coast at the water's edge. The platforms cluster exactly where that water emerges. Even interior monuments sit near drinkable water. Places with no fresh water had no platforms. The researchers were explicit. This association was tested quantitatively and was statistically significant in a way the other resources simply were not. So, the Moai landscape was not random. It was not pure obsession. It was organized around the single resource that keeps people alive. The monuments marked the lifelines. And the transport, the part everyone calls impossible, has a working evidence-based answer. Now, the island's own oral traditions say the Moai were walked. Researchers analyzing the road statues, their shapes, and how they are distributed, have argued the multi-tonon figures were engineered to move upright, rocked forward in a controlled walking motion with ropes and teams of people, and that the method needed surprisingly modest resources rather than the catastrophic deforestation the old story demanded. The statues were not just art. They were designed objects shaped for their own journey, which raises a harder question. If these people engineered statues that could walk to water, what does it mean that we keep finding their work still locked in the ground? The statues beneath the earth. Here is the detail that ambushes almost everyone. And it is the hinge the whole video turns on. The world's mental image of Easter Island is a row of giant stone heads on a grassy slope. Reasonable assumption. Completely wrong. They are not heads. They are full figures carved from the crown down through a torso to a base. And the reason the planet pictures heads is that the most photographed statues stand on the slopes of the Ranororaku quarry, where over centuries sediment washing down the volcano slowly buried them up to their necks. The bodies were never missing. They were just under the ground, and the quarry itself reads like a workshop where the workers walked out mid-shift and never came back. Nearly half of every Moai ever made still sits at Ranororaku. Hundreds remain there in every state imaginable, finished statues that were never moved, and almost as many still half-carved. Some were abandoned when the carvers hit a vein of harder rock buried inside the soft tuff and simply started a new one. The place is a snapshot of a process caught in stone, and the soil has been quietly swallowing it the entire time. And this was known a long time before it ever reached you. In 1914, a British expedition reached this remote island, the Mana expedition, led by Catherine Routledge, one of the first outsiders to seriously investigate Rapa Nui. Picture her there, standing on the quarry slope, recording statue after statue, documenting that the famous heads continued downward into the earth as full bodies. Specialists have known the Moai had bodies for over a century. Routledge wrote it down. It simply never escaped the archives into the public imagination because the photos that traveled the world stopped at the neck. The misconception became the icon, but the burial did something nobody planned. When the Easter Island Statue Project carefully excavated buried statues in the early 2000s and 10s, the soil had acted like a sealed shell. It had protected detail that the exposed, weather-blasted Moai had lost long ago. And what came out of the dirt was startling. The buried torsos were covered in crisp carved designs, petroglyphs, including crescent shapes researchers connect to canoes, preserved in near-perfect condition because the earth had shielded them from centuries of wind and rain. The team also found large post holes that likely served as anchor points, stone carving tools left where they were set down, and traces of red pigment, a hint that these figures were once colored for ritual. The buried portions were time capsules, specific statues in the quarry interior cataloged with identifiers like RR-01-156 and RR-01-157 became the focus of the first controlled, documented scientific excavations ever performed in that part of the quarry carried out by an all-Rapa Nui excavation team under the project's direction in formal agreement with Chilean institutions. Some had been crudely dug at by earlier expeditions decades before in barely recorded ways. This time, every available scrap of information was salvaged, and it kept happening. As recently as early 2023, the dried bed of the lake inside the Ranororaku crater gave up a Moai nobody had ever recorded. Picture the moment. Volunteers working in the crater to restore its marshland in the cracked floor of a lake that had gone dry. And there it is, a whole statue lying on its back, gazing up at the sky that no survey, no expedition, no record had ever caught. Not pulled out of a deep dig, revealed because the environment itself shifted and showed it. So sit with the logic. Entire multi-tonon statues stayed completely hidden beneath the surface of this small, relentlessly studied island into the present decade. Some are still surfacing. The geophysical surveys say there are likely many more. So when researchers point radar and resistivity at this ground and detect buried features and anomalies, the question was never whether something could still be down there. And it turns out the surface was hiding more than statues, seeing the whole island from above. The technology above the ground rewrote things just as hard as the technology below it. In 2024, a research team published a study in the journal Science Advances that did something the old debates never could. Instead of guessing the island's ancient food production from scattered samples, they read the entire island from orbit. They use shortwave infrared satellite imagery, a band of light extremely sensitive to subtle differences in moisture and mineral content, paired with a machine learning model trained to recognize the island's distinctive rock gardens. Those gardens were a brilliant adaptation. The Rapa Nui broke up rock and worked it into the soil to release nutrients, hold moisture, and shelter crops like sweet potato, taro, and yam against relentless wind. A documented ingenious technique used in different forms by other cultures around the world. The old estimates had assumed those gardens blanketed a large fraction of the island, which implied a huge population that then catastrophically crashed. The satellite and machine learning analysis found something different. The real extent of rock gardening was far smaller than previously claimed. Earlier work had mistaken other features, including roads, for gardens. Based on the corrected figure, the food this system could produce, combined with marine and other resources, points to a sustainable population in the low thousands. The researchers estimated the island could support on the order of around 4,000 people. They manually verified the model and were candid about its accuracy and its limits. The point was never a magic number. The point was this: the island never sustained the enormous population the collapse story requires, and you cannot fall from a peak that was never there. Same philosophy as the radar. Remote sensing, digital terrain analysis, computational modeling layered together, reconstructing this island at a precision that was impossible before. The landscapes of construction projects, detailed topographic mapping, and three-dimensional recording of the quarry surfaces did the same for the construction zones. Piece by piece, Rapa Nui is being rebuilt as a digital model, and the model does not look like a society in free fall. It looks like something the old story got backwards. And the genetics are about to say so out loud. What changes everything here is the payoff. It is not aliens. It is not a secret civilization. It is bigger than that because it is the actual history flipping over. The old theory said the Rapa Nui were a warning that they overran their environment, destroyed their forests, fought, starved, and collapsed into a broken remnant before Europeans ever landed. A tidy story about human foolishness. The evidence-based view is close to the opposite. A genetic study published in the journal Nature in 2024 analyzed ancient DNA from 15 individuals who lived on the island going back to the 17th century. The researchers found no sign of the dramatic genetic bottleneck a real population collapse would have left in the genome. Instead, the data pointed to a small population that grew steadily until the catastrophe that did happen, and it came from outside. In the 1860s, slave raiders from Peru forcibly removed roughly a third of the island's people. The devastation of Rapa Nui was real, but the evidence increasingly says the wider world inflicted it. The islanders did not do it to themselves before that world arrived. Separate research using radiocarbon dating and environmental modeling published in Nature Communications reached a parallel conclusion. The population was resilient and stable across centuries even as the climate dried out. The researchers framed the Rapa Nui not as a failure, but as a striking case study in sustainability. People who adapted ingeniously to one of the most resource-starved places humans have ever permanently lived. And then the twist that genuinely widens the whole frame. That same 2024 ancient DNA study, alongside other genomic work, found Native American ancestry in the Polynesian genetic record consistent with contact occurring well before Columbus reached the Americas. In some analyses dated to roughly the 13th to 15th centuries, this is the genetic side of a clue that had puzzled researchers for decades. The sweet potato, a crop native to the Americas, was already growing across Polynesia long before any European arrived. And so was the bottle gourd. Plants and now genes telling the same story. The ancestors of the Rapa Nui were part of the greatest oceanic voyaging tradition in human history. Navigators who crossed thousands of kilometers of open Pacific and who the evidence increasingly suggests reached the Americas first. The image of a primitive people trapped and doomed on a rock does not survive the evidence. Now pull it all together. Ground-penetrating radar, resistivity, seismic survey, drone and satellite imaging, machine learning, ancient DNA, independent tools, independent teams aimed at the same island from the surface and from beneath it. And they converge on one conclusion. Beneath Easter Island, in the soil and in the data, lies the record of a society that was organized, adaptive, technically masterful, and far more connected to the wider world than the old story ever allowed. The buried features the surveys detected, the statues still locked in the ground, the gardens read from orbit, the genomes recovered from the dead. All of it describes engineers and navigators, not a cautionary tale. That is what changes everything, not a fantasy city under the dirt, something more powerful. The truth finally surfacing that we had this entire civilization wrong for a very long time. And the island is still holding back. The surveys themselves say many buried Moai are likely still out there undetected. Statues are still being found. So, I want your answer in the comments. And be honest, if this much stayed hidden beneath one of the most studied islands on Earth, and the people who built it were this far ahead of what we assumed, what do you think is still waiting under the ground at Rapa Nui? And would you want it dug up or left exactly where it lies? Tell me below. And if this rewired how you see Easter Island, send it to the one person you know who still thinks those statues are just heads.